For the past 3 years, fellow artist and YouTuber Bill Making Stuff has hosted an annual robot building challenge called Big Bot Bash. It involves a random attribute generator with plenty of Bill-branded insanity, and absolutely no 3D printing is allowed. This year, I participated in this challenge with the added requirement of somehow weaving it into my ongoing world-building project and writing an accompanying short story. So if you like kitbashing, robots, and sci-fi short fiction, this video will be right up your alley. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. This is Bill's junk bot generator, a sheet full of descriptors for various robot body parts. Each section lists 20 different possibilities, corresponding to the sides of a D20. To know what I was supposed to build for my robot, I rolled first for the head. 17, hot. For the body, 14, seen better days. For the arms, 16, armored. For the hands, 14 again, two-handed. For the legs, 2, leg day. And finally, for overall flavor, 1, for rusty. The unique thing about this challenge is being forced to accommodate all of these weird attributes into a single cohesive build. And of course, I've got the added challenge of tying it into my world. If you're new to my channel, that world is Aegis, which has been gradually populated by dozens of models and stories in a series I call Beyond the Blight. Typically, I approach my builds with a particular scene, character, or mech as my focus, but with a challenge like this, the form had to come first. This project was also an opportunity to finally break into a big box of model kit scraps I'd purchased months prior on eBay, which is where I usually go for pieces. Purchasing junk lots like these is actually a lot like the Big Bot Bash itself. It's a roll of the dice, full of surprises, and this lot added a ton of car model pieces, stuff I don't use too often, to my stockpile, along with a huge array of water slide decals, and I spent the next day trimming, cleaning, and sorting everything. While this might seem like a bit of wasted effort, I always do this first with big lots of stuff, as I try to familiarize myself with all the new pieces before chucking them into bins. And by meticulously sorting everything by shape and size, some rough ideas began to take form. This fuselage bit, for example, seemed like a good start for a head, especially with these vents in the sides, which could work well for the hot attribute. These bucket seats also just screamed shoulder armor to me, satisfying the armored attribute for the arms. I drew these shapes over and over, mashing together different parts and different combinations, including some bits I already had on hand, like these feet from a Mobile Suit Gundam model kit. And after lots of experimentation, taping things together and trying to visualize a result that would check off all of Bill's boxes, I finally settled on the pieces I'd use for the bot and got to work on the final concept art. Since I'd done so much sketching at this point, this step wasn't really necessary, but I'm glad I did it, because it gave me a chance to troubleshoot some of the areas I hadn't yet figured out, particularly the joints. I find myself obsessing more and more over the realism of these builds, trying to create designs that make sense from an engineering standpoint, with pistons, wires, and joints placed to suggest real-world use, and that means analyzing pieces carefully to determine how to attach them to everything else. With the pencil sketch down, I went over everything with water-resistant ink pens, using thick felt tips for the outlines and thinner tips for the details. Last came the color. I laid down the accents first, a red-orange and then tan. Next came the main body color, for which I selected this pale green. I was a little nervous to go for a pastel palette the first time I tried this for one of my mechs, but in the end I really liked it, especially when contrasted with this vibrant orange for one of the arms. Finally, to satisfy the final overall flavor attribute, rusty, I painted in lots and lots of rust. And with the concept finally finished, it was time to build. After a bit of brainstorming, I decided to fill these gaps in the fuselage with grills from the recent lot of parts, giving them the appearance of glowing hot radiators. Flat styrene was added on the ends so that I could attach some outlets on the other side made from styrene tubes. I then glued the two fuselage halves together with Weld-On 3, Glued is actually the wrong term here, since this chemical actually melts and fuses the plastic together. Also, this stuff evaporates really quick, so I use a pipette to add just a little bit at a time to the bottom of a soda can. Weld-on was also used to add these details to cover up some of the gaps. Next came what I think is the fuel tank from a motorcycle model. To make sure the fit was snug and symmetrical, I first filled it with aluminum foil, then added a layer of epoxy putty beneath that. This allowed me to nudge and squeeze the part into place and gave it a lot more points of contact so that it wouldn't break off later. I also added some strips of epoxy as an overhang on the edges to fill in the gaps on the sides. Silicone tools helped to ensure this was as seamless a transition as possible. For the back of the head, I modified this tank turret with my miter saw, capped it with a tailor-cut circle of styrene, filled it with foil and epoxy, then added this vent detail to hide the gap. With the rear area finished, I taped it temporarily into place and then took some careful measurements, since this internal bit would need to be carefully fitted to the interior dimensions and also be strong enough to hold the arms. But the biggest challenge with this piece is that it had to match the contour of the body, which hadn't yet been built. This meant some experimentation with cardstock templates and styrene until I got the fit just right. When doing styrene templates like this, I always cut them slightly larger than I think I'll need, because then I have some extra material to sand away later, creating a tighter fit. I won't pretend this was easy though, as I also had to get the thickness of the insert just right to fit the gap in the body. However, when it did finally come together, it was totally satisfying. After gluing in this window bit from some plastic packaging, which I wouldn't be able to access later, I slid in the custom-built insert and welded everything into place. A square styrene tube was used to fill this gap here, and then I sanded down some old superglue nozzles for the arm rotors and glued. These little pipes, attached with green stuff, fit perfectly here. And then it was on to sprue hunting for panel details. I also came back and sanded this area here since I really wanted a smooth and seamless transition. I had just purchased these foam sanding sticks along with a bunch of other sanding tools, and they were a huge help. I always get questions about the tools and supplies I use, and I'm actually considering assembling and selling my own simple toolkits on my website, which would include things like the sanding tools, small bits of green stuff, nippers, and maybe some sample styrene. I figured this might be a nice thing for beginner builders looking to experiment before investing too much money. Let me know what you think of this idea in the comments. Once all the panels and pipes were finished, it was just a matter of filling some of the holes and gaps with details, which came mostly from the box of junk bits. However, I also decided to break into these old motorcycle toys, which are an absolute treasure trove of bits when it comes to making mechs. For example, this double cradle bike chassis felt like it would really give the mech a heavy, industrial appearance. It also made it feel just a bit more like a submarine, which was good, because this would be my first ever AQUAMECH. Now, for those of you familiar with my stories, this may start ringing a bell. For 3 years now, we followed the stories of Mig Poyle, Captain Tarkini, their AI Audda, and more recently, submarine owner Sable in their quest to recover a sunken cache of stolen gems. But if you want a refresher, or if you're brand new to the channel, you can find a playlist for all the treasure hunter stories in order here. And while we're on the topic of stories, I'm thrilled to finally announce the release of the German translation of my very first Beyond the Blight novel, The Children of Aegis. This 500-page translation is truly a labor of love, with countless hours poured into translating, beta reading, and editing, and I worked closely with the translator to ensure that the end result was a faithful, enjoyable adaptation. You can get the book worldwide on Amazon in various formats, so be sure to check it out. To replicate the look of insulated cables, like these astronaut umbilicals, I tried a new method, slightly flattening this epoxy sculpt, then twisting it, then letting it harden for just a few minutes before gently shaping it. For a little gas tank, I used this airbrush nib container, glued on this sawed-off nozzle, added some epoxy to round off the end, then stuck in a styrene rod to mount it to the back of the mech. More details were added by modifying various Gundam parts and gluing them to surfaces that lack detail, like this flat area here, which would eventually become the hips. Car hubcaps were glued on, then epoxy and wooden beads were added, which were nice since they had a built-in hole for the wire axles, which would be drilled and inserted later. With all that done, I went back to the head to add these vent flaps. Originally there was a spoiler type thing back here in the concept, but I really liked the flaps instead, as I thought it gave the AQUAMECH just a bit more character. After a bunch of styrene fins were glued in, I added the flaps by making this little hinge with bits of styrene tubing. For headlamps, a necessity for the pitch black of deep sea, I added these model bits here, then drilled holes and inserted some waxed thread to serve as electrical wiring. Since the epoxy for the cables was now totally cured, it was time for the final step, adding mounting brackets made from cut strips of heat shrink tubing. With the body finished, it was time to get cracking on the arms, which would be held in place with a wire axle. To angle the shoulders back slightly, making for a more dynamic pose, I added a bit of epoxy putty, then capped it with a tank wheel, and then added more wheels. Then came the armored shoulder pads, inspired by these bucket seats. The quality of the mold was pretty terrible though, so all this flashing had to be sanded down, as this would be one of the most exposed and visible parts of the finished mech. If you've spent as much of your life looking at Star Wars designs as I have, you probably immediately recognize the arms of this guy, since I based them off of these ATST legs. After carefully trimming them down with a jeweler saw, I welded the two halves together, drilled holes for the axles, then attached them to these Gundam forearms and filled in the gaps with styrene. I then created these tiny slanted outlets for cables, which would be added later. Green stuff helped me to get the shoulder armor in just the right place, and once it dried, I peeled the armor away so that it could be painted separately. The nice thing about using Gundam forearms is that they already have holes for the hands, so it was just a matter of finding some plastic that would fit snugly, which came from these sprues. The palms were also made from Gundam parts, though some serious modification had to happen to get the right thickness. Once the halves were glued together, filled, and sanded, I began crafting the fingers, made from hollow 2mm styrene square tubes. Using a very thin drill bit, I made holes in the hands, glued in some paperclip wire, slid each finger segment into place, then trimmed the excess. Green stuff was then put in place for the fingertips and joints, and the finished hands were added to the sprues, using paperclips once again. Further arm details were achieved with styrene rods and lengths of green stuff, which had been rolled out and positioned a day earlier when still soft. Finally, some anchor hooks were made with brass rods and installed into the shoulder armor, which is how I imagine the mech would be raised and lowered into the water. With the upper half of my AQUAMECH complete, I moved on to the thighs, which were also custom built from 060 styrene. I went this route because it matched the concept art, and I didn't have anything of this shape and size that would fit the hip joints. Once the thigh sections were built and sanded, some details from various kits were glued on. Finally, these fenders were added from the ATST kit. Now, because the legs looked just a bit too square, I also decided to add a bit of epoxy putty here for a curved shape. Once it was dried and sanded, this was the result, and it was onto the knees, also made from tank wheels, plus these ATST leg bits. And these pistons made from styrene. With everything glued in, I dry fit the thighs in place and started working on the calves. The concept art was heavily inspired by these Gundam legs, so that's what I started with here, though a lot of modification was done. Another supply that I used generously during this build was this solvent-based compound, specifically designed for filling nicks and holes in plastic models. After drying, it could be sanded for a smooth finish. Next, to exaggerate the calf texture, I drilled out and sanded these holes. Next came the hardware that would attach to the knee. Then I drilled holes and installed these paperclip wires covered in styrene sleeves. With that done, these armor bits were added here, and to keep the feet consistent with the rest of the AQUAMECH, I bent a pair of styrene rods into a U shape and glued to the heels. Yet more pistons were added to the ankle joints to make this thing look as mechanical as possible, and finally some extra details like these vents and some cables made from green stuff were stuck in place. For the base, I had initially wanted to do an underwater scene, but I was extremely wary of doing such a large resin pour, so instead I decided to set the scene in a dry dock. I started with a simple pine wood box from the dollar store, which I topped with cheap 1mm thick cork. Once the Mod Podge dried, I trimmed away the excess, but quickly noted that the top pine layer was so thin and flimsy that it actually bowed under pressure, so I reinforced it with some 060 styrene from within. Although cork is pretty convincing as asphalt at a larger scale, I thought it was a bit too rough for my mech, so I used compound once again to vary up the texture for more visual interest, but also make the asphalt appear a bit smaller in scale. I also smeared some modeling putty onto the edges to hide the seam between cork and wood. Finally, everything was sanded down for a smooth finish and wiped with a damp rag. I then laid everything out on some cardboard with duct tape so that it could be easily primed. I went with cheap rattle can flat black for the primer coat, which I found applies much finer than the pricier stuff. I decided to go dark with the base layer and add lighter coats on top. I took a moment to admire these fine seam transition I'd sanded from epoxy putty, satisfied for once with how well it turned out. Pleased with the primer coat, it was time to paint. So please sit back and enjoy the next installment in the Treasure Hunter storyline. For years, Audda had watched from behind the oculars of her beachfront bastion, observing the travelers walk up and down the coast. Wanderers and nomads, pirates, prisoners draped over flotsam, who washed onto her shores, then took their first unsteady steps in the spongy sand. After Audda had been moved from that crumbling brick edifice to the flying market, she'd been granted the opportunity to watch a new group, the crew. Audda had observed and studied. She'd plotted data points and collated the results, and she believed that you could tell a lot about a person from the way they walked. Take Mig, for example, legs straight, chest up, arms swaying with the constancy of metronomes as he paced the Bonguale's loading bay, going over his checklist. Here was the stride of a confident man. Here was a man who had not been born into royalty, but had brushed against it and taken some of it with him, the way a person might brush against a newly painted wall and transfer some of the pigment onto their sleeve. This was the stride of a man who knew what he wanted and how to get it, even if his methods sometimes made him more of a con artist than a master strategist. Next, Tarquini. The captain's posture was nowhere near as formal as Mig's, broad shoulders bunched up in a tight knot of muscle, his head hunched low, neck invisible, so that in profile he looked rather like a question mark. When he walked, he kept his fists out and clenched at his sides, his arms barely swinging, like a fighter striding into a boxer's square. This was the walk of a man marked by his past, but not defined by it, his movements coming in spurts and bursts, body tense, a stubborn fish fighting its way upstream. He'd been handed nothing in this world, and so he'd grown to believe that the only way to get anything was with clenched fists, one holding a tool and the other a weapon, and sometimes those were the same things. Then there was Milo, the scrawny fisherman, always in his stained rubber waders that went quack, quack, quack when he walked. His bouncing stride was nothing like the other two. His arms swung in wide, carefree arcs, bony palms flapping at the wrists like the swatting tails of flounders caught in a net. He bobbed with almost simian movement when he walked, whistling through his yellowed teeth, commenting on the weather, noting that the fish would be biting today. He was nowhere near as bright as the other two. He was happy soaking in the sun and endlessly casting lines into the tumbling seas below. Finally, Sable, the newest addition to their crew, the tallest of the four men, with a dense and unruly beard and floppy hair that covered his forehead and dangled in his eyes. As he paced the cargo area, he kept his hands clasped at his chest, giving him a fretful, fidgety look at odds with his form. He shuffled rather than strode, his steps small and hesitating, but Audda liked him the best. She had from the moment they'd started communicating about the submersible, and she was pleased that she'd secured him such a significant cut of the treasure. And the best part was, Audda was pretty sure they'd found it. It had taken almost 100 low-depth UUV dives with long-range scanners probing the sea floor, and she just about fried her circuits processing the complex 3D topography, but the results left little doubt in anyone's mind that they'd finally stumbled on at least part of the missing gem cache. But locating the treasure was only half the battle. Recovering it was the other. From their scans, they determined that the cache was comprised of 7 separate containers. If they were full, each would weigh approximately 900 kilos. The Banguale, however large, did not have cranes capable of hauling such weight, nor could its crew perform the necessary modifications without attracting the interest of others. The solution to this had been converting Sable's submersible into a full-fledged AQUAMECH, with hydraulic-powered arms and powerful articulated hands. The machine's task would be to carefully open the containers one by one, move the contents to smaller containers, then carry these up to the surface, where the Banguale could haul them aboard, piece by painstaking piece. The operation could take days or even weeks, since they could only work under the cover of darkness to avoid drawing attention. But when they were finished, they would be wealthier than they could imagine, and they could imagine a lot. There was, however, a catch. The location they'd uncovered was beyond the 1.3-kilometer range of the UUV's signal capabilities, meaning it could not be piloted remotely. And so, Audda had volunteered. It made sense, installing an AI into the AQUAMECH. They all trusted her, and she would be able to manage the complex controls better than any human in their circle, none of whom had any remote automecha piloteering experience. It took 3 weeks to get her properly installed, and she ran so hot that once they turned her on alongside the reactor and the rest of the machinery, she only had about 20 minutes before overheating caused serious damage to her components. Fortunately, deep waters would be cool enough to manage the heat. "Online!" Sable shouted over the noisy machinery of the loading bay. The headlamps of the AQUAMECH flickered on and the rotors groaned to life. The AQUAMECH straightened before him. "Hello, Sable," Audda said, her voice broadcasting over the tinny speakers mounted to the Banguale's walls. She quickly tested the dozens of articulated joints on the heavy suit while monitoring the steady stream of data from the sensors and oculars. "Everything functional in there?" Sable asked. "Yes, you've done a wonderful job, Sable," Audda replied. "You'll be careful with Yeri, won't you?" asked the man, his face chiseled with worry. "Yes, I know how much she means to you." "That cache has been there a long time," Mig said. His voice, as always, was as hard as metal. "Do a thorough visual analysis before moving anything, and make sure the containers are secure before you ascend." "Of course, I understand," Audda said, noting the heat readouts. She had about 5 minutes left before overheating became an issue, and in spite of the significance of her role in this mission, all she could think about was walking. She thought again of the merchants and travelers and pirates that traipsed across her old shores. She remembered the day Mig and Tarquini had walked up to her bastion, the day that changed her life. She herself had walked only once, when she propositioned Sable to join this expedition, but that had been merely a simulation. This would be different. This would be a physical thing, really walking. She turned the heavy machine towards the edge of the deck and stepped off, wondering what Audda's walk said about Audda.
It's delicate, the way we move.
you all so much for watching, and to Bill Making Stuff for hosting this challenge. Be sure to check out the other big bot submissions. If you'd like to support this channel, consider checking out my Patreon page, where I frequently post works in progress and even share updates on my next novel. You can also find loads of t-shirts, stickers, patches, and more on my website, gameybuilds.com. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.